There are palaces designed to be seen. And there are palaces designed to erase you slowly while the world applauds your transformation. From the outside, House of Grimaldi looks like a dynasty carved out of myth, sunlight on marble, wealth without limit, a legacy that survives centuries by mastering one thing better than love: control. And when Princess Charlene of Monaco stepped into that world, the narrative was already written for her. A swimmer becomes a princess. A commoner becomes royalty. A woman becomes a fairy tale. But fairy tales, in Monaco, are not stories you live. They are roles you perform, until there is nothing left of the person who entered. Because Charlene was never meant to shine like a princess. She was meant to stabilize a system. And systems like this do not break you loudly. They don't need to. They just teach you how to disappear, gracefully, silently, completely. And the most disturbing part? By the time the world noticed something was wrong, she had already become a ghost inside her own life. So the question is not what happened to Princess Charlene. The question is, what kind of system turns a living woman into a ceremonial absence and calls it royalty? Before Charlene ever entered Monaco, the system was already complete. It did not begin with her. It did not depend on her. And most importantly, it did not exist for her. The House of Grimaldi is not just a royal family. It is a survival machine disguised as glamour, a dynasty that has endured not by emotional stability, but by strategic reinvention. For over 700 years, Monaco has functioned less like a nation and more like a stage set, a carefully curated illusion where wealth performs permanence and power hides behind elegance. But survival at that level comes with a cost. Because when a family must preserve its image across centuries, individuals inside it are no longer treated as people. They become components. Roles are assigned. Narratives are controlled. Emotions are edited. And nowhere was this more visible than in the story that shaped Monaco's modern myth, the transformation of Grace Kelly into a princess. Grace Kelly was not just a bride. She was a solution. When she married Rainier III, Prince of Monaco, Monaco needed legitimacy, attention, and a narrative strong enough to compete with global fascination. Grace provided all three. She brought Hollywood into royalty, turning Monaco into an international symbol of beauty, romance, and unattainable perfection. But beneath that transformation was a quiet transaction. Grace Kelly did not simply gain a crown. She surrendered authorship of her own identity. Her career ended overnight. Her voice softened into diplomacy. Her presence became symbolic, not personal. She was no longer a woman navigating life. She became a living emblem of stability. And that is the first unwritten rule of Monaco. You are not loved for who you are. You are valued for what you stabilize. When Grace died suddenly in 1982, the tragedy did more than break a family. It fractured the illusion that Monaco had carefully constructed. The perfect princess, the untouchable narrative, the emotional center of the monarchy, was gone. But the system did not grieve the way individuals do. It adapted. Because dynasties do not process loss emotionally. They process it structurally. The burden of continuity shifted to her son, Albert II, Prince of Monaco. And Albert did not inherit just a title. He inherited a contradiction. On one hand, he was expected to modernize Monaco, to present a progressive, stable, emotionally accessible monarchy in a world increasingly skeptical of inherited power. On the other, he was bound to preserve the same rigid architecture that had kept the Grimaldi dynasty intact, which meant he had to become two things at once: a man and a system. But systems don't feel loneliness. Men do. Albert's life unfolded under a kind of quiet scrutiny that is more suffocating than scandal. He was not a rebellious prince, not a charismatic disruptor. He was something far more complicated, a placeholder of continuity. His role was not to shine, it was to maintain. And that created a vacuum. Because when your purpose is to uphold a legacy, not to define yourself, intimacy becomes secondary. Relationships become strategic. Marriage becomes structural. Love becomes negotiable. By the time Albert reached the age where the world began asking the inevitable question, where is the princess? The pressure was no longer personal. It was institutional. Monaco needed a new symbol. Not just a wife. Not just a partner. A presence that could repair the emotional fracture left by Grace Kelly. Someone who could stand in the space of a myth, without disrupting it. But here lies the hidden violence of such a role. You are not chosen because you fit. You are chosen because you can be reshaped. And so the criteria were never spoken publicly, but they were always there. She must be elegant, but not overpowering. Visible, but not expressive. Graceful, but emotionally contained. Strong enough to endure, but quiet enough to disappear. Because Monaco did not need another Grace Kelly. It needed the echo of her, without the unpredictability of a real human life. This is the second unwritten rule of Monaco. The princess is not a person. She is a function, a stabilizing force, a visual reassurance, a controlled emotional narrative. And by the early 2000s, the system had begun searching again. Not for love, but for alignment. For someone who could step into a role already defined, already constrained, already haunted by the ghost of perfection. Someone who would not resist the transformation. Or at least, someone who would learn not to. Because in Monaco, resistance is not crushed violently. It is absorbed. Silently. Gradually. Completely. And somewhere far from this polished system, in a life untouched by royal architecture, untouched by inherited expectation, untouched by the invisible contracts of legacy, there was a woman who had spent her entire life mastering something very different. Control over her own body. Freedom over her own path. Identity built through effort, not inheritance. A woman who had learned to move through water with precision, but had never been trained to survive inside a system designed to erase movement altogether. Her name was Charlene Wittstock, and she was about to step into a world where the greatest skill is not strength, but disappearance. Before she became a princess, she was a body in motion, not symbolic, not observed, not interpreted, just real. Princess Charlene of Monaco was not raised inside a system of inherited identity. She was shaped by something far more honest and far more demanding, performance tied to effort. Growing up in South Africa, her world was not governed by legacy, but by repetition. Early mornings, cold water, the quiet violence of discipline. Swimming is a solitary language. You compete alone. You suffer alone. You win, or fail, alone. And inside that environment, Charlene learned a very specific psychological truth. Your value is something you build, not something you inherit. This belief would later become her greatest strength, and her most dangerous vulnerability. Because systems like Monaco do not reward self-built identity. They replace it. As a competitive swimmer, Charlene's relationship with control was intimate. She controlled her breathing, her timing, her body's limits. There was clarity in that life. Pain had purpose, effort had direction, identity had boundaries. You knew who you were because you earned it daily. But what happens to a person whose identity is built on control? When they enter a world where control is no longer theirs? That question began forming long before Monaco. Because beneath the discipline, beneath the strength, there was something quieter, something less visible, but just as important. Charlene was not raised to perform emotionally. She was not trained in public expression, nor in the subtle diplomacy of image management. Her world did not require her to smile on command, to embody narratives, to suppress discomfort for the sake of perception. She was not conditioned to be watched. She was conditioned to focus. And that creates a gap, a psychological blind spot that only becomes visible when the environment changes. Because when you are raised in a system where effort equals worth, you expect the world to operate on the same logic. But Monaco does not reward effort. It rewards alignment. And Charlene, without realizing it, carried into that world a set of internal rules that no longer applied. That authenticity would be recognized. That silence meant peace, not suppression. That strength meant independence, not compliance. These are not naive beliefs. They are functional, in the right environment. But in a system built on preservation of image, they become points of fracture. There is also something else, something more human, more fragile. Athletes often build identity around a single axis, performance. When that axis disappears, so does the structure that holds them together. By the time Charlene's swimming career began to fade, she was entering a psychological transition that many athletes face, but few understand in real time. Who are you when the thing that defined you is gone? This is not just a question of career. It is a question of existence. Because for years, her identity had been anchored in measurable outcomes. Times, rankings, achievements, a world where feedback was immediate and honest. But outside that world, identity becomes abstract, unstable, negotiable. And it is precisely in that moment, when a person is between identities, between structures, between definitions of self, that they become most vulnerable to systems that offer replacement, not support. Replacement, a new role, a new narrative, a new version of who you are supposed to be. And often, it comes disguised as opportunity, or even love. But here is the hidden truth about Charlene's psychological formation. She was strong, but her strength was context-dependent. She knew how to endure physical pressure. She knew how to push through pain. But she had never been trained to recognize emotional containment disguised as elegance. She had never learned how to navigate a world where silence is expected, not chosen. Presence is symbolic, not personal. Identity is assigned, not developed. And most dangerously, she had never needed to question whether the environment she was entering was designed to support her or absorb her, because until that point, her life had always followed a simple equation: effort, progress, identity. But Monaco operates on a different equation entirely: compliance, acceptance, disappearance. And Charlene, standing at the edge of that transition, did not yet see the difference. What she saw was something else: a man, a possibility, a life that looked like expansion, not restriction. But what she was actually stepping toward was not a new version of herself. It was a system waiting for her to become less. Because the most dangerous transformations are not forced. They are accepted willingly, before you understand what they will cost you. And just before everything changed, Charlene was still someone who believed that entering a new life meant becoming more, not realizing. Some systems do not ask who you are. They ask how much of you can be removed without resistance. It never begins as a trap. It begins as proximity, a meeting that feels incidental, a connection that appears unscripted, a shift that looks like expansion. When Prince Albert II of Monaco met Princess Charlene of Monaco, the narrative was almost too perfect to question. A prince with the weight of legacy, a woman with discipline, beauty, and a life outside the system. It looked like balance, like something human entering something institutional. But systems like Monaco do not seek balance. They seek stability disguised as romance. Because for Albert, this was never just about companionship. It was about resolution. The monarchy had existed too long without a princess, too long without a central feminine figure to stabilize its image, soften its edges, and restore continuity. He did not just need a partner. He needed a structure that could be seen. And Charlene, without realizing it, fit the architecture perfectly. Not because she was similar to the system, but because she was different enough to be shaped. This is the paradox of elite selection. You are not chosen for compatibility. You are chosen for malleability under pressure. At first, the relationship moved in a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Public appearances, shared moments, gradual exposure to a life that seemed elevated, not constrained. But beneath that surface, something quieter was already happening. Charlene was not being integrated. She was being repositioned. Every step closer to Monaco was a step further from the environment that had defined her. Her language shifted. Her posture refined. Her presence recalibrated. These were not dramatic changes. They were subtle, incremental, almost invisible. And that is how systems rewrite people. Not through force, but through adaptation you don't realize you're making. Because resistance requires clarity. And clarity is the one thing the illusion phase carefully removes. By the time the engagement was announced, the world saw what it wanted to see. A modern fairy tale. A prince who had finally found his princess. A woman stepping into history. But what the world did not see was hesitation. Not loud, not defiant, but present. There were moments, fleeting, almost deniable, where Charlene's expressions did not align with the narrative being built around her. A certain stillness, a certain distance, a kind of emotional withdrawal that did not fit the script of joy. And in systems like this, emotional misalignment is not explored. It is corrected, because the image must remain intact. The closer the wedding approached, the more irreversible everything became. Royal marriages are not private decisions. They are institutional commitments. Once announced, they move forward with a force that overrides personal uncertainty. This is where the trap closes, Not suddenly, but structurally. Because at a certain point, the question is no longer, do you want this life? The question becomes, how do you perform it convincingly? The wedding itself, broadcast, celebrated, immortalized, was not just a union. It was a conversion. A swimmer became a princess. A private individual became a public symbol. A woman became a role. And roles, unlike identities, do not belong to you. They belong to the system that created them. There is a detail often mentioned, but rarely examined. On the eve of the wedding, rumors surfaced that Charlene had tried to leave Monaco. That she hesitated. That something inside her resisted the final step. Whether exaggerated or not is almost irrelevant. Because psychologically, what matters is this. Even the presence of that rumor reveals a fracture between the narrative and the reality. And fractures, in systems like Monaco, are not allowed to expand. They are sealed. Quickly, quietly, permanently. The ceremony went on. The vows were spoken. The image was secured. But something fundamental had already shifted. Because entering a system is not the same as belonging to it. And Charlene, standing at the center of that spectacle, had crossed a threshold that cannot be reversed. She was no longer someone who could step away. She had become someone who must remain. And this is the true nature of the trap. It does not lock you in physically. It redefines the cost of leaving, until staying becomes the only survivable option. From the outside, everything looked complete. A princess had been crowned. A dynasty had been stabilized. A fairy tale had been fulfilled. But inside that completion, there was a quiet beginning. Because what had just been sealed was not a love story. It was a contract between an individual and a system that would slowly decide who she was allowed to be. And the most dangerous part? The world would spend years celebrating the image, while missing the fact that something underneath it had already begun to disappear. At first, the system worked. Or at least, it appeared to. Princess Charlene of Monaco stepped into visibility the way Monaco required. Composed, measured, almost sculptural. Her presence was not loud, not emotionally expressive, but that, in this environment, was interpreted as grace. Silence was reframed as elegance. Distance was mistaken for dignity. And the world accepted it instantly. Because the illusion did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be familiar. A beautiful princess. A composed marriage. A royal family restored to visual completeness. The narrative reassembled itself with remarkable speed. Media outlets began writing the story for her, softening her edges, simplifying her complexity, translating her stillness into serenity. She became the modern princess, the reserved royal, the quiet strength beside the prince. But these descriptions were not observations. They were assignments. Because once a system defines how you are seen, you begin to lose control over how you are understood. Charlene's silence was no longer hers. It belonged to the narrative. And that is how illusion sustains itself, not by hiding reality, but by relabeling it. Inside that image, milestones began to appear, each one reinforcing the perception of stability. Public appearances, charitable engagements, carefully choreographed moments of connection. And eventually, children. The birth of twins, Jacques, hereditary Prince of Monaco, and Princess Gabriella of Monaco, did more than expand the family. It solidified the dynasty. The line of succession was secured. The future of Monaco was no longer abstract. From the outside, this was the ultimate confirmation. The system works. The princess has fulfilled her role. The fairy tale is complete. But fulfillment, in this context, is not emotional. It is functional. And once a role is fulfilled, the expectations do not end. They deepen. Because now, Charlene was no longer just a wife. She was a mother within a monarchy, a symbolic anchor for the next generation, a living bridge between past illusion and future continuity. And that position comes with a quiet, suffocating truth. You are no longer allowed to destabilize the system that depends on you, which means your emotional reality becomes negotiable. Your discomfort becomes irrelevant. Your identity becomes secondary. At this stage, the illusion reaches its most dangerous form, not because it is convincing, but because it becomes self-reinforcing. The more the world believes in the image, the harder it becomes for the person inside it to contradict it. Because contradiction creates tension. and tension threatens the system. So the system responds the only way it knows how: by smoothing, by refining, by reducing anything that does not fit the narrative. Charlene's public appearances grew more controlled, her expressions more neutral, her presence increasingly minimal. It was subtle enough to be ignored, but consistent enough to form a pattern. And patterns, when observed carefully, reveal something that headlines do not. She was not becoming more comfortable. She was becoming more contained. This is where the illusion begins to fracture, not visibly, but psychologically. Because there is a difference between choosing silence and being shaped into it. There is a difference between composure and emotional withdrawal. And there is a difference between being respected and being managed. But from the outside, none of this was visible. Because Monaco does not project conflict. It projects continuity. And Charlene, standing at the center of that projection, had become almost too perfect for the role, too still, too composed, too aligned. Which raises a question the illusion does not want asked. What happens to a person when every visible part of them is functioning, but something invisible has already begun to shut down? The answer does not arrive all at once. It builds, quietly, gradually, behind expressions that reveal nothing, until one day, the absence becomes harder to ignore than the presence itself. And that is when the illusion can no longer hold. The system never announces the moment you begin to disappear. There is no visible rupture, no dramatic collapse, just a slow shift, where presence turns into performance, and performance begins to hollow out the person beneath it. For Princess Charlene of Monaco, the reality did not arrive as a single crisis. It arrived as accumulation. Small silences that grew longer, public appearances that felt heavier, an internal dissonance between who she had been and who she was required to remain. Because the role of a princess in Monaco is not emotionally expressive. It is structurally obedient. You are expected to exist within a narrow psychological bandwidth. Visible, but not vulnerable. Present, but not personal. Engaged, but never revealing. And over time, this creates a kind of internal fragmentation. A split between the external self, the one that smiles, stands, performs, and the internal self, which begins to lose language, lose space, lose legitimacy. This is not dramatic suffering. It is something far more dangerous. The gradual normalization of emotional absence. There were signs, not loud enough to disrupt the narrative, but persistent enough to disturb anyone willing to look beyond it. Charlene's expressions became increasingly distant, as if her body was present, but her attention was somewhere else entirely. Her posture remained perfect, but her energy receded. She fulfilled the requirements, but without the invisible thread that connects action to meaning. And this is the hidden cost of roles like hers. You can do everything right, and still feel like you are no longer inside your own life, because identity requires authorship, and Charlene's authorship had been quietly removed. But the system does not interpret this as loss. It interprets it as success. A well-integrated princess is one who does not disrupt the image, one who does not introduce unpredictability, one who becomes, over time, indistinguishable from the role itself. And Charlene was moving toward that state, not because she wanted to, but because survival inside the system required it. This is where the psychological tension becomes almost unbearable, because what she needed, though never publicly stated, was something fundamentally incompatible with the structure she inhabited. Space to exist beyond expectation. Emotional reciprocity, not symbolic partnership. The freedom to define herself outside the role. But what she received was something else entirely. Containment, observation, expectation without negotiation. And over time, this mismatch creates a specific kind of internal fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but existential depletion. The feeling that every version of yourself presented to the world is no longer connected to who you actually are. And when that disconnection persists long enough, the mind begins to search for escape, not necessarily from the system, but from the self that has been constructed within it. Charlene's prolonged absence from Monaco, framed publicly as a health issue, became one of the first undeniable disruptions in the narrative. Official statements spoke of infections, treatments, recovery timelines. But beneath those explanations, there was a deeper truth that could not be easily articulated. The body often breaks, when the mind has run out of ways to endure. Because psychological pressure, when sustained without release, does not always express itself emotionally. Sometimes, it relocates into the body, into fatigue, into conditions that require distance. And distance, in Charlene's case, became both a necessity and a threat. Because stepping away from Monaco, even temporarily, introduced a dangerous possibility that she might remember who she was before the role. And systems built on continuity cannot afford that kind of remembrance. Because once you recognize the structure you are inside, you can no longer fully belong to it. This is the paradox she faced. To recover herself, she needed distance. But to remain in the system, she needed absence of self. And so the tension escalated, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. A quiet battle between the person she had been, the role she had become, and the growing awareness that the two might never reconcile. By the time she returned, something had changed. Not in the narrative. The narrative remained intact, carefully restored, publicly reaffirmed, structurally protected. But in her presence, there was a difference. Not collapse. Not rebellion. Something more subtle. A kind of emotional vacancy that no longer tried to disguise itself as elegance. And that is when reality fully emerges, not when the system breaks, but when the person inside it stops fully participating. Because the final stage of psychological containment is not resistance. It is detachment. And once detachment sets in, the next phase is no longer about endurance. It is about survival. Collapse, in systems like Monaco, is never allowed to look like collapse. It must be reframed, contained, translated into something acceptable. When Princess Charlene of Monaco disappeared from Monaco for months, the official narrative remained controlled: a medical complication, a necessary recovery, a temporary absence. But time does something the system cannot fully control. It stretches explanations until they begin to fracture. Because absence, when prolonged, stops feeling temporary. It begins to feel like withdrawal. And when Charlene finally returned, the image that greeted the public was not restoration. It was diminishment. Her body appeared thinner, more fragile. Her presence, once carefully composed, now carried something heavier, something harder to mask. There was a visible dissonance between the role she resumed and the energy she brought back into it. And this is where the illusion finally begins to fail, not because the system collapses, but because the human body refuses to cooperate with the narrative. Because you can train posture, you can control expression, you can rehearse behavior, but you cannot indefinitely hide what prolonged psychological pressure does to a person's internal structure. At this stage, the question subtly shifts. Not what is wrong, but what has this environment done to her? Because collapse is rarely a single event. It is the cumulative result of prolonged emotional suppression, lack of authentic connection, sustained identity dissonance. And when all three converge, the outcome is not dramatic rebellion. It is something quieter, something more unsettling, a kind of internal shutdown. There were reports, again, controlled, carefully worded, of exhaustion, of emotional and physical strain, of the need for extended recovery beyond what had initially been disclosed. But the language never fully captured the reality. Because reality, in this context, is not just about health. It is about capacity. The capacity to continue performing a role that no longer aligns with the self. And when that capacity is exceeded, the system does not break. The person does. What makes Charlene's collapse particularly disturbing is not its visibility. It is its containment. Because even at her most fragile, the structure around her remained intact. Appearances were managed. Statements were issued. The narrative was adjusted, but never abandoned. This is the final function of a system like Monaco. It does not prevent collapse. It absorbs it and continues, which creates a haunting contradiction. From the outside, the monarchy still appears stable. The roles are still occupied. The image still holds. But inside that stability, there is a person who has already crossed a psychological threshold, a point where endurance becomes unsustainable, identity becomes fragmented, presence becomes purely functional. And once that threshold is crossed, something irreversible happens. You may return physically. You may resume your role. You may even appear recovered. But the internal relationship to that role has changed permanently. Because collapse is not just about breaking. It is about seeing clearly, too late, what you are inside of. And clarity, once it arrives, cannot be undone. This is the part no fairy tale accounts for. The moment when the princess understands that the palace was never a home. It was a structure she was placed into, to hold something together that existed long before her, and will continue long after her. And in that realization, there is no dramatic escape, no visible rebellion, just a quiet, devastating truth. She is still there, but not in the way she once was, because the system did not lose her. It kept her, just without the parts of her that once made her fully alive. After collapse, there is a phase that looks like recovery. But it isn't. It is recalibration. When Princess Charlene of Monaco re-entered public life, the system did what it has always done best. It adjusted just enough to restore continuity, but not enough to change its core. Appearances resumed. Schedules reassembled. The image stabilized. From the outside, it resembled healing. But psychologically, something far more complex had taken place. Because Charlene did not return as the same person who entered the palace years before. She returned as someone who had seen the structure from the inside and survived it. And survival, in environments like this, does not mean restoration. It means adaptation, a quieter presence, a more measured engagement, an emotional distance that no longer tries to disguise itself as anything else. This is not weakness. It is a form of containment turned inward. Because once a person recognizes that their role cannot be escaped, they stop trying to fully exist inside it. Instead, they create a separation. Not physical, psychological. A version of themselves that performs what is required, and another that retreats, protected, unreachable. And this is where Charlene's identity begins to shift, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. She is no longer trying to become the ideal princess. She is learning how to coexist with the role without being entirely consumed by it. But coexistence has a cost, because the more you divide yourself to survive, the less integrated you become. Moments with her children, Jacques, hereditary Prince of Monaco, and Princess Gabriella of Monaco, now carry a different weight. Not just maternal, but protective. Because unlike her, they were not stepping into the system. They were born into it. And that changes everything. Charlene is no longer just a participant in Monaco's structure. She is now a witness to its continuation, through the lives of her children, which introduces a new psychological burden. Not just surviving the system, but watching it prepare to shape the next generation. And here lies the quiet transformation that defines the aftermath. She is no longer trying to escape. She is trying to endure with awareness. And awareness, in this context, is both clarity and isolation. Because once you see the system clearly, you cannot fully believe in it again. You cannot lose yourself in the illusion. You cannot mistake performance for identity. So what remains? Not rebellion, not freedom, but something more ambiguous. A life lived in partial presence, where you show up, but not completely, where you fulfill expectations, but without internal attachment, where you exist within a structure, but no longer let it define your entire sense of self. From the outside, this looks like stability. From the inside, it feels like permanent distance. And that distance becomes the new equilibrium. Not joy, not fulfillment, but survivability. Because in the end, the system did not release her. It did not need to. It simply adjusted around her, until the version of her that once resisted was no longer required to function. And what remains is not the woman who entered Monaco, nor the one who collapsed under its pressure, but someone else entirely, a person who understands the cost of the role, and continues to play it anyway, not because she believes in it, but because leaving it would cost even more. What happened to Princess Charlene of Monaco is not an exception. It is a pattern, a quiet architecture that exists in every system where legacy matters more than the individual who carries it, where families become institutions, and institutions require sacrifice disguised as privilege. Because power, at this level, does not operate through force. It operates through absorption. It takes a person, removes what does not fit, and preserves what can be displayed. And then it calls the result identity. The tragedy is not that Charlene suffered. The tragedy is that her suffering was structurally necessary. That her silence made the system look stable. That her disappearance made the illusion feel complete. And this is the part most people never question. We are taught to envy lives like hers, to see royalty as elevation, to interpret access as freedom. But what this story reveals is something far less comforting. The higher the system, the less room there is to be human inside it. Because in the end, Charlene did not lose her life. She lost something far more difficult to name, and far more common than we admit. She lost the ability to exist without being defined. And perhaps that is the real cost of entering a palace like Monaco. Not imprisonment of the body, but the slow, elegant erosion of the self. Until one day, you are still there, still seen, still photographed, still admired, but no longer fully alive in the way you once were.